each time, but we've had you on many times. And I put it to you that there's good news and bad news. The good news is that you were right. The bad news is that you were right. What have you made of the last 3 weeks?
Well, I suppose like all of us, it's a mixture of things. First shock, then horror, then shock again, then horror, then disappointment, and then rage. Probably. Rage. In roughly that order. Horror at what happened in Israel. Shock. Shock like everyone this was able to happen. Horror at the details of what happened. Shock then at the response on the streets of cities like the one we're sitting in London. The fact that there were so many people who didn't even give it a day before they turned out on the streets of my city, supporting the people who'd done.
Love the way he just said, my city. Just basically saying it right then and there, that the shock and horror of these people coming out in support of Hamas. Absolutely despicable, disgusting.
On this act of terror. And then in the weeks since, increasing rage. Rage that I have to share a country with these people.
And I think the thing that we've all had to come to terms with is how some people have just been so open about supporting an extremist Islamist terrorist group and also refusing to acknowledge it as such.
Well, before you answer, Douglas, one of the things that I've noticed in comments is people like, well, these are pro-Palestine marches. And I think we have to be clear that what we're talking about is in the first 2 days prior to Israel responding in any way, there were people celebrating.
Yeah, you did, but the bodies of the dead hadn't even been found. They were still warm in some cases. Some people were still in the process of being massacred. And even as that was still going on, people were already out in the streets of cities like London, protesting against Israel. And that was what it was. It was straight away a protest against Israel. And, you know, look, there are lots of fine delineations you can do about it, some of which are true and some are not. You could claim that the people who've come out in recent weekends on the Saturdays care about Palestinian lives. I don't think they do.
They don't.
I just don't think they do.
They don't. They're just out there.
I'll tell you one reason why, is that nobody in the Middle East, apart from the Israelis, cares about the Palestinians a jot. I've traveled around the region. I've spoken to enough people, including leaders of other countries in the region, to know the Jordanians do not like the Palestinians at all. They find them an unbelievable West Bank who should effectively be in Jordan. The Egyptians loathe the Palestinians.
So true.
The authorities are keeping the border between Egypt and Gaza closed because they hate the Palestinians. I know people who were born in Gaza when Gaza was owned by Egypt. If Egypt wanted to solve the Gaza problem, it could do so tomorrow by taking control of Gaza or allowing the people of Gaza to go into Egypt, where they should be. Nobody else in the region cares. The Qataris host Hamas and fund Hamas, as well as, of course, pumping billions of pounds into countries like this one to make us deeply compromised. But nobody in the region cares about the Palestinians. Certainly nobody cares about them more than the Israelis, who go to incredible efforts to try to limit the deaths and the mistreatment of the Palestinians, even as the whole region, the world, has given them these people to look after. Nobody really cares about the Palestinians, and frankly, the idea that Muslims care about their brother Muslims is absolute rubbish. I think we've flattered much of the so-called Muslim street by even pretending this in recent years. You know, hundreds of thousands of Muslims have been killed in Yemen in the last few years, and there hasn't been a protest 1% of the size of what we've seen in recent days and weeks in the West. Hundreds of thousands of Muslims have been killed in Syria in the last over a decade, since the civil war in Syria, by Assad, by the Assad regime, by rival jihadist groups, by intra-religious sects, and much more. And we haven't seen 1% of the people who turned out on the streets this day. The idea that Muslims actually care about their fellow Muslims.
You know, what Douglas is saying is so true. It is so true. that Muslims upon Muslim violence is the greatest perpetrator of terrorism that occurs to the Muslim population. It's Muslim upon Muslim violence. And as Douglas was saying, all these atrocities that occurred, the number of Muslims killed in Syria, in Yemen. Did you see any protests at all, folks? Any protests out on the streets? Any United Nations march? Anybody ripping down posters of people missing? No, not at all. The number of Muslims that were killed in Afghanistan by Muslims. Anybody protest outside of Afghanistan? Streets of New York? Streets of London? Streets of Rome? Gay Paris? No. New York City? No, you didn't hear any of that. Any protest? Any protest at all for the Muslims being killed under the Taliban regime? Any protest of anybody of an LGBTQ or gays or lesbians that were being killed in Muslim countries just for being gay or lesbian or transgender or whatever, being thrown off of buildings, being executed? Anybody have a protest for that? What about the 1 to 2 million Muslims in China that are being held in concentration camps? Any protest at all for that? No, you don't hear that at all. There's no protest. None. Donald Trump had to bring it up to the United Nations when he was president. And everybody basically pounded upon him for mentioning it. Folks, this is what we got in store for you today. This is what's on tap. You're watching the Dr. Nasir Shaikh Show. I'm your host, Dr. Nasir, where I give you my political prescription from my political perspective. What happens when you have Douglas Murray at a sit-down interview asking questions of him as to what does he think is happening in the world? When you've got social media, culture, religion, Islamism, fundamentalists, terrorists, Hamas, Israel, governments all come clashing together. Let's get back to more of the interview with Douglas right now.
Is insane. They don't. What they care about is Jews. There is something at the very root of Islam and followers of the Muslim religion who cannot bear any war in which Israel is fighting, and most of all loathes any war in which Israel is winning. And you can see it. It's at the absolute core of their being. This is why they are on the streets of this city and others marching. It's not because they love fellow Muslims, it's because they hate Jews.
So you're saying there's something at the root of the religion. Well, let's tease that apart. What do you mean by that?
Well, there's two particular things worth mentioning. One is, of course, that Muhammad, the founder of Islam, himself beheaded, massacred many, many Jews. Famously, there's one battle in particular, and the Banu Quraysh. It's a story you can find in the Quran and the Hadith, and of course this is because the Jews would not accept the revelation of Muhammad, such as it was, and so they were seen within Islamic tradition as being one of the first people who turned down the opportunity to join Islam, and as a result, of course, Muhammad decapitated hundreds and hundreds of Jews. So that's not a good start. But there's a bigger thing, I think, within the Muslim world which is worth mentioning, which the late Bernard Lewis pointed out on a number of occasions, which is the great problem within Islam when it comes to not just Judaism but the wider non-Islamic world is that the Muslim religion claims to be the last revelation from God to man, which, as we all know, is a very large claim to make. It says there have been previous revelations, but this is the last and final one. And what's more, God has given you a book, the Quran. And the Quran is the one book you need. The opening, here is the book wherein is no doubt, which is quite a bold claim as well, I'd say. But the claim at the foundation of Islam is, here is the book wherein is no doubt, and it's the only book you need. And it's the final word from God that man will ever have. Now, if you are the recipients of this book, the people who end up either converting or being forced to convert to Islam, and eventually the areas that Islam takes over by force, if you are somebody who's brought up in that tradition, you would think that being the recipient of the final revelation from God, you would be in a just tip-top situation. You know, you would imagine that, well, this is going very well. We've got the final revelation from God. What's not to like? What's not on our side? And then several things happen in the millennia since, which is, first of all, many, many Muslims realize that despite having the final revelation from God, things don't seem to be going very well. Until oil is discovered in certain parts of the Middle East, most people live in total destitution. The discoveries and enlightenments of Europe largely passed the Muslim world by. This shouldn't be exaggerated. Certain parts of the Muslim world, of course, give the Western world certain parts of what becomes the Western European tradition. So there were times of interplay. There were times of mutual learning. And now, of course, everyone looks back at them, or many people look back at those times with nostalgia. Nevertheless, in the main, the Muslim world cut itself off from the rest of the world and didn't care to learn from the rest of the world, didn't improve the economic conditions of its people, totally failed to create societies anything like as successful as, for instance, European societies. And therein a question arises, which is, if we are the recipients of the final revelation, why is everything so awful where we live? And then you have the additional thing, which is, and how come the Jews return or re-establish of course, many Jews are already living in the area that's now Israel, but already lived there, but many others come from other parts of the world, including from the Middle Eastern countries where they're chucked out by the governments in 48 and so on. The Muslim world sees this tiny, tiny bit of land, which, among other things, is the only bit of the Middle East that doesn't have any oil. And they make of it a much more successful country than any of the countries around. Now, if you create a Palestinian state, you just have another failed Arab state, another failed Muslim state to add to the more than 50 already failed Muslim and Arab states. What is the explanation that the Jews who refused the Prophet's invitation to Islam are still here, have this tiny bit of land, and make all of these discoveries and other things that show themselves to be so successful? It's some kind of stab in the heart. And instead of saying, we're doing this wrong, the thing is, the Jews are doing something right, and that must mean that they've rigged the game. That's why they care, among other things. And it leads to the deep pathology of anti-Semitism, which has been largely eradicated in Europe among Europeans, not entirely, but largely. There are still some bits of the far right you can find across Europe, and occasionally in the UK with a sort of the whiff of this noxious thing still emerges. On the left, of course, it's much closer to the boat. But principally anti-Semitism in our own day, of the kind that we hoped had ended with Hitler, exists and indeed thrives in the Muslim world. And the Muslim world is now in our world in Europe, and so we have the Hitlerian horrors of anti-Semitism back.
Well, I have no doubt.
You know, I think Douglas brings up a great point here. I guess in one word you could sum it up. I mean, it's a type of jealousy. Absolutely. Take a look at Israel and see what it has done with a small piece of land, no oil, just done it with a democratically, elected, system of government, surrounded by Muslim countries that in some instances, because of the black crude, because of the oil, have been able to build, beautiful cities or whatever. But in the meantime, there are so many in the Mideast that are not as well off. But take a look at the billions of dollars that have been given to the PLO and to Hamas. Don't you think they could have done something within the Gaza? something on the West Bank, built some sort, the Singapore of the Mideast. They could have done something like that, but no, they squandered it. But when Douglas talks about, in the past, where there was that interplay, there were times when the Muslim empire was at its height in the world, as like were other empires at the time. They came and went. The Persian Empire. What was happening during the Persian Empire? Art, literature, science, music, all those things flourished. And there was an exchange between the Muslim world and the other world. The Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire, all these empires were beautiful, huge cities were created. People were, at that time, there was an abundance for whatever abundance was in those times. Sure, there were lots of people that didn't have, but these were huge empires that were built upon the backbone of the Islamic faith. And there were many sects at that time, not just Sunni and Shia, but many, many sects of Islam at that time. But we come now into the, as we move forward, 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st century, as he correctly states, most of the Muslim countries are completely downtrodden. Nothing at all like, the Muslim empires or Muslim countries were in the past. And so, unfortunately, there is this anti-Semitism that does run, not just among, the Muslims, but among a lot of other people as well, as Douglas points out. I mean, I think it's a lot more in Europe than Douglas, says, but, there's that whiff he talked about of anti-Semitism. But as far as the Hitlerian type, the association of the Hitlerian association with terrorist groups like Hamas, PLO, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, I guess you could put a little bit of, the Hitlerism into the Islamism of those people that are the terrorists, those fundamentalists, those Islamists that are out there committing these acts of terrors, not only against the Jewish people, but against Muslims themselves, who they feel are not Muslim enough to be part of their Islamism or their brand of theocracy and their brand of the new caliphate that they want to establish. Anyways, folks, we appreciate you taking the time to watch. You've been watching the Dr. Nasir Shaikh Show. I've been your host. My name is Dr. Nasir. If you haven't done so already, we'd love for you to subscribe to the channel, like, share, and follow us. Let us know what you think in the comments below. What do you think of Douglas's comments? My final thought, as always, when you're right, and when you're left, you're wrong. Until next time, folks, take care and stay safe.